Okay, so Expedition 33 has broken the games industry. And if you guys have been keeping up on social media, it has continued to break things. Not only has this independent game coming from an unknown studio gone on to sell millions of copies worldwide, also being universally praised pretty much worldwide, but it has now become one of the most awarded games in the history of video games, standing toe-to-toe with games like Baldur's Gate 3 and Elden Ring. Now, while it was one of the most awarded games in the history of the medium until some of those awards were stripped from them, it turns out it's not just AAA these guys are threatening, but the entire industry. Quite an insane achievement, if I do say so myself, especially coming from a studio that apparently spent less than $10 million to make their game, and that most of their team found each other on social media, a team that's mostly comprised of people that had never even made a video game before, outside of a handful of developers that were former Ubisoft developers, which is just more salt in the wound for AAA as these guys have seen more of their games fail this year and more of their former employees find success. Success that I am sure they wish they had. Expedition 33 represents what I think is a shift that started with Baldur's Gate 3. A movement away from traditional games, traditional studios, traditional design, something that is going to fundamentally shift how this entire industry operates, who they are making these games for, how they are making these games, and most importantly, how much these games cost. So today, I want to talk about how Expedition 33 broke the games industry. I want to talk about how they rewrote the rules on how games are made, how even their more recent controversies are going to have long-term impacts inside the games industry, and how through limitation, these guys found something that this games industry lost a long time ago. Character. So as many of you might know by now, Expedition 33 won 9 awards at this year's Game Awards, becoming the most awarded game in the 12-year history that this show has been running. And honestly, I don't think anybody was surprised by it at all. This year has been an incredible year for games, like genuinely stacked. But Expedition 33 was just a dead ringer for every single category it was entered into because it really was just that good of a game. It absolutely deserved Best Narrative. It's one of the best written stories we've seen in years, full of grief, hope, mystery, suspense, and twists that I don't think anybody really saw coming. I think the writing really respected the audience. It trusted you. It didn't hold your hand, and it just opened up the more time you gave it, and it told a story that I just don't really think we see very often in video games. It also had some of the strongest voice performances of the year, a soundtrack that's been listened to over 400 million times since launch, and some of the most visually distinct art direction that we have seen in years. Across the board, this game delivered. Now, I can and honestly will make a few concessions. I do think that the Game Awards went a little overboard this year with Best Debut Indie Game nomination. That one really didn't make a lot of sense, especially because this game technically has a publisher. And as much as I love Expedition 33, I don't think it really deserved Best RPG over Kingdom Come Deliverance. I mean, in that game, you literally play as Henry. You play that character in a way that almost no other RPG even tries to attempt. With that said, without a doubt, unanimously and ubiquitously, Expedition 33 was the best game of the year. That was obvious the moment that this game launched, and it became clear after a first-time studio blew past 3 million, then 5 million, and now 6 million copies sold after the Game Awards. This level of success and recognition is usually reserved for AAA franchises and industry veterans, not for first-time studios, and that's where Expedition 33 really starts to tear at the seams of the games industry, because in their eyes, this shouldn't have happened. I mean, outside of a handful of developers at Sandfall Interactive, mostly just a couple of former Ubisoft developers, nearly every single person on that 30-person team never made a game before. Hell, most of them have never even worked in the games industry before. The game's writer, Jen, she had never had any of her writing published. She was an investment banker that they found on Reddit. Same thing goes for the composer, somebody that they just found on a random music site. The game's producer and co-founder came from the French equivalent of Uber, and nearly every other developer on the team is either a fresh graduate or somebody that has never worked in game development at all. I mean, even Guillaume Broche, the studio's founder and creative director, yes, he worked at Ubisoft, but he worked in marketing, not game development. That was not his discipline. He was self-taught. He learned by watching YouTube tutorials, something that he picked up out of boredom while he was working at Ubisoft. So what we end up with is essentially a ragtag group of misfits making one of the most recognized games in the industry. People who have never been in game development before. I mean, I've even seen claims that some of the game's animators were found on YouTube and they've never even worked a project full time. And in this industry, none of this makes any sense. It goes against every single convention. It goes against reality in a lot of cases. Or it's just going to come with the same assumption, which is that all of this inexperience and all this lack of investment means inefficiency. And that inefficiency means higher cost. But none of that checks out, because this game that we initially thought was made for less than $50 million was in reality made for less than $10 million. GameSpot mentioned this earlier in an article titled "Clair Obscure Expedition 33 Budget was remarkably small," where Eddie Mockick writes, "Clair Obscure Expedition 33 has been one of 2025's breakout success stories in gaming, and it was developed on a relatively small budget, apparently. The New York Times reports that the budget was less than $10 million, crediting the information to the developer Sandfall. The report added that the team conserved resources by purposefully avoiding making an open-world setup in favor of making Expedition 33 a turn-based game. Sandfall's Guillaume Bro said that the studio has the right technology to make those games with a relatively small team, and he hopes to see more like it from other studios. Games like this are coming. We are lucky to be early," he said. Broche did not elaborate on what technology he was referring to. GameSpot has contacted Sandfall for further details. Guys, I have been ripping into the games industry for the better part of a year, talking about how these studios do not need to be spending $300 or $400 million to make these games, but even I am going to say, to see a game like Expedition 33 made for less than $10 million is just insane, especially given the experience level of this team, because what that's telling us is that while this team may not have traditional credentials, they were clearly committed, disciplined, and extremely talented. You do not pull this off by accident. You do not stumble into this kind of efficiency. And I know that the media has been throwing accusations at Sandfall, trying to make sense of these guys, basically ever since the moment that the game took off. First it was, well, it's not actually a 32-person team. They outsourced everything. But now I'm even struggling to see that and make sense of that at all, because if you look at this game's budget, you don't outsource a meaningful amount of this game and ship it like you did for under $10 million. That number only tracks if the core team was doing most of the heavy lifting themselves. And at the end of the article, the writer can't even help themselves. Broche didn't elaborate on what technology they were using. Excuse me, sir. Are you using the technology that we have all deemed evil and will cancel you over? Quite literally writing articles saying that that's exactly what our plan is going to be? I don't know why these guys are baiting, especially since players have had all the answers to this months earlier when leftover placeholder assets were found in the game, essentially like right after the game had launched. Assets, by the way, that came from Unreal Engine 5 tools, not Gen AI directly, something that the team did not mean to ship with and immediately patched out the moment that it was found. But, the damage was already done. Here's the media yet again spinning it up, tying it to the broader AI panic, dragging it back up into conversation with the Divinity and Larian discourse. Now suddenly Expedition 33 is part of this wide controversy that it never actually invited, that then snowballed into the Indie Awards just recently getting involved and stripping Expedition 33 of its awards, making them out to look like a liar, something that I genuinely would not lose sleep over if I was Sandfall. This is the same group that stripped another developer of their recognition because the company that was manufacturing the cartridges that their games were printed on were tangentially connected to a defense contractor. It's all performative. These people are an absolute joke. I think what both these developers and these writers are actually afraid of is much simpler than what they're letting on right now. Games like Expedition 33 or studios like Larian risk creating a use case for AI that they can't easily shut down, because it's easy to get people riled up over AI slop, over Call of Duty or Battlefield selling generated cosmetics. That's clean outrage. It's very predictable. But when a studio delivers a game of real quality, real care, real value, and it tops the charts, it wins awards, and players love it, well, selling that same narrative is going to get a lot harder. I think that there has been this overwhelming, desperate desire for Expedition 33 to just be this impossible game, something that the industry can just explain away because of its quality, because of how it was made, because of who it was made for. This is unapologetically a game for gamers, for JRPG fans and turn-based fans. It launched at $50 and then went on sale day one for $40, then went back on sale after they won the Game Awards, and then they even added free DLC, knowing full well that players would have paid for it. There was just nothing weird about this game from the player's side. Nothing cynical, nothing exploitative, and nothing really strange from the developer side either. And in this industry, that just doesn't fit. Expedition 33, and more importantly, Sandfall Interactive, represent this overwhelming threat to the games industry, because for all intents and purposes, this was a AAA game. Or at least what AAA used to mean to a lot of people before a lot of those expectations got sanded down to nothing. It looks like one, it plays like one, it sounds like one, it feels like one. And for a team like this, to pull that off, to be recognized the way that they are in this industry, to be talked about the way they are, while having next to no traditional experience, all the while spending less than $10 million to make this game, that is brutal. Because by doing that, you didn't just succeed, you just made the entire industry look incompetent. I mean, we already knew that at some level, but my God, Expedition 33 didn't outsell Battlefield, Call of Duty, Monster Hunter, or Borderlands, but it stood next to them. It occupied the same space, the same conversation, while spending, 2% of what those games cost to make, with a team that for the most part had never even made a game before. Once a game like this exists, the usual excuses just stop holding up anymore. And when that happens, the conversation stops being about the game. It starts being about everything else around it. If I am an investor at one of these massive publishers and I'm watching my massive corporation get completely finessed by a game that spent 2% of the budget with 2% of the people, and the vast majority of them have no idea what they're actually doing, I'm going to have a lot of questions. A lot of questions. And I guarantee a lot of these CEOs' ears are ringing right now, because if you look at the year that we've seen for AAA, it's been rough. Like one of the worst years that I've ever seen. I mean, outside of Nintendo, which is basically a cult, Battlefield and Ghost of Yotai, maybe? I guess we could probably throw Arc Raiders into that mix, but I don't know if you want to call that one a AAA game or not. I guess it is. I don't know. Outside of that, I don't think many of these guys have been able to hit their sales targets. I mean, Borderlands 4 barely ran. Call of Duty, woof. Assassin's Creed. Monster Hunter fell off of a cliff. Xbox has had one of the worst years that I've ever seen a single publisher have. Like, it has been brutal for these guys. We have an entire graveyard this year. Meanwhile, every success that we've seen has been either independent, indie, or AA, which is just crazy. And when you have a game that shows up that's this transformative, this impactful, this successful, and it's made with so few resources, well, these guys are essentially an invasive species. They're messing up everything for everybody else, because these guys have been sitting around the entire time telling us that they have to charge more for games. We heard about it over the last 2 years. $100 games, got to have $100 games. Guys, you don't understand. These budgets just keep going up. Inflation is rising. But then all of a sudden we have a game that comes out that looks better, plays better, charges less, and was made with less money. That completely rewires perception. The other thing that I think is happening that makes this even more dangerous for AAA is that these guys are essentially normalizing the unknown studio in the eyes of consumers. A lot of people are used to buying from the same companies. They're used to buying the same names, the same franchises. And now all of a sudden we have these companies that are coming in here that are disrupting things that are actually starting to look a lot more consistent and a lot more trustworthy than the names of the games that they've been buying for years. And that is incredibly dangerous for a lot of these companies, because their name is largely what's made them all their money. That trust that they've built over the years is what's made them all of their money. If you lose that trust and now all of a sudden players are starting to favor companies that they've never heard of before, well, that completely flips everything on its head. And that makes a lot of sense when you think about it. Because the funny thing is that if we rewind the clock, where did a lot of this trust come from? Well, it came from the fact that a lot of these studios, these smaller studios that are breaking out and having insane success right now, they used to be these AAA studios. They're coming from the same origins. They used to be these scrappy studios. And I think that they don't realize yet that it's the struggle that's making these studios so successful. It's the limitations of these studios that are leading them to make better games. And I think the games industry forgot that struggle isn't a flaw, it's necessary. When I keep going back over some of the successes of some of these smaller games, I always end up getting stuck on the same question. At some point, it just hits me, and I'm just like, how the hell did you guys do this? Where did you find the time? How did you find the money? Why did you take the risk when all the odds were against you? And in a lot of cases, I can't really explain that, so I just turn it into an underdog story, or I just point to something else. I talk about how all these games have their own little moment, like how Expedition 33 landed in a genre that was overdue for its own it game, how Megabonk just had this viral push, how Schedule 1 blew up because of streamers latching onto it. And you can look at that and you can say, well, that explains how people found it, but I think that's where we get stuck, myself included. We fixate on the moment, the timing, the hook, the part that looks repeatable. And the more that I've thought about it this year, the clearer it's become that none of that actually matters if the game itself isn't good enough to be able to hold people once they're there. These moments do not create success, they expose it. So the real question is, how are teams that we have never heard of making games that feel this focused, this confident, and this complete? How are games that would have been ignored 10 years ago suddenly resonating with players so hard? People are playing these games, they're not bouncing off of them, they keep going, they finish them, they talk about them, they recommend them, and once you start seeing that, the question starts to narrow. What separates these developers from the rest of the industry? And the answer that keeps coming up isn't luck, isn't timing, it's restraint, or more specifically, limitations. Okay, so let's take Sandfall as the obvious example here. They had very little funding and next to no experience. Most people at the studio had no idea how to make a game, lead a game, or write for a game, none of it. So how do you end up with something this good under those conditions? Well, the only way that you're ever going to make up for what you lack, it's the same as any rich man, poor man story: work ethic, obsession, and talent. And not in a mythical sense, but in a willingness to just grind until something clicks. I'm sure that they have a couple of savants that are over on that team, but I don't think that's the point. I think the real difference is that they wanted it badly enough that they applied themselves completely. They didn't have the resources. They didn't have the institutional knowledge. So they stayed disciplined. They taught themselves. And probably more importantly, they taught each other. And I think that that's what made this game have such a clear, authentic voice, from its music to the art direction to the combat systems. This feels like a group of people that were constantly talking, supporting each other, course correcting, and learning together because, well, they didn't have any other option. And I can't help but feel like that's just how game development used to work, but likely doesn't for a lot of these bigger companies. Think about how much the games industry has changed in a relatively short amount of time. I mean, the games industry is only about 50 years old right now, and when it started, people weren't making games because there was money in it. There wasn't any money in it. They were making games because they wanted to. There wasn't a clear career path. You couldn't go to school for game design. Graphic design and digital art weren't even established fields yet. People were doing everything themselves because they had to, because they loved it, and also because there was no other way. Now, over time, it turned into a real industry, a big one, and along the way, priorities shifted, and it became less about the work itself and more about efficiency, more about scale, more about business optimization. And in that transition, a lot of the friction that forced people to be creative and collaborative just disappeared. And that's the contrast that I keep coming back to when I look at games like Expedition 33 or a lot of the indie successes that we've seen in 2025. If you look at the games industry right now, all these guys are chasing games with no friction, no restraint, no limitations. Budgets are completely out of control, all in service of just removing as much resistance from the process as possible, all in an attempt to make these games faster with bigger teams, more money, more outsourcing. The idea that you can just throw enough resources at a problem and that game is just going to magically come together, but that's not what's actually happening. What's happening in the end is that you're coming up with a lot of games that just have no clear creative voice, because whenever these studios are hitting a problem or they find something that they don't understand, what they do instead is they just throw more developers at that problem. They don't actually try to learn how to solve it. They don't slow down and try to figure it out. They just buy the solution. They outsource it. They plug it with another department, another contractor, another tool. So instead of collaboration, instead of learning, instead of people actually talking through their problems, we just get silos. We get everybody that is locked into their own discipline. Everybody is good at one narrow thing, and almost nobody has a broader understanding of how the game is supposed to feel, play, or come together as a whole. And on top of that, this industry has started leaning harder and harder into raw hardware power, faster GPUs, more memory, bigger headroom, just so they don't have to worry about the technical constraints or the performance issues anymore. And once you do that, now all of a sudden the game itself isn't even pushing back anymore. Mistakes aren't getting punished. You don't have to solve the problems cleanly, and you don't even have to be careful. You can just brute force your way through a lot of your bad decisions because the hardware will carry it. Obviously, we've learned that that's definitely not the case with most of these games nowadays. But I don't think that just killed optimization. I think it bled straight into art direction. Everybody's been chasing photorealism. Everybody's been chasing high fidelity. Everybody has to look expensive. They have to look detailed and hyper accurate. And in that process, a lot of these games just stop looking distinct. I mean, honestly, 90% of games right now look either like Call of Duty or Fortnite. That sameness isn't accidental. It's just a byproduct of this industry trying to optimize for scale instead of clarity or creativity. if we actually go back to earlier console generations, we see a lot more artistic creativity and a lot more mechanical experimentation. And that's not because the developers were smarter, but it's because they were just boxed in. They had hardware limits, knowledge limits, tool limits. You had to work around your problems instead of past them. And that forced a lot of people to be inventive. You see the same thing in indie today because those limitations are still there. Some of them are self-imposed, sure, smaller teams, smaller budgets, and people that are doing 5 jobs at once, but the pressure is still real. They don't get to waste time. They don't get to bloat systems. They have to make decisions and they have to commit to them. Now let's compare that to an industry that is actively trying to erase its limits. Bigger teams, bigger budgets, more tools. Now we add AI on top of that, not used as a tool, not used as assistance, but instead used as insulation, a way for them to just avoid friction altogether. And I don't think that creativity comes from ease of access. I don't think it comes from convenience. I think it comes from trial and error, from desperation, from trying to make something work when it definitely shouldn't, from caring enough to wrestle with the problem instead of just trying to smooth it over. And I think that's why studios like Sandfall scare people. That's why indie and independent studios scare people, because these guys care enough to make it happen under any condition. These guys thrive on friction. Their success is built on challenge, not running from it. The enemy of art is the absence of limitations, Orson Welles. And I think that's true. I think the scrappier the development team, the more likely they are to want it more than anybody else, because these guys, their backs are up against the wall. They don't have a lot of options. They don't have a lot of resources. They don't have a lot of experience. And to be able to make a game, I mean, to even just make sure that game even exists, you have to really want it. And I think that desire to really want it makes a massive difference. Beyond that, the other part I think really plays a role into this is just how compartmentalized a lot of these companies have gotten over the years. I mean, Guillaume Broche, when he was talking about how basically every single developer at Sandfall, while working on Expedition 33, had to wear multiple hats. Each one of these guys had to do all kinds of different roles because they just didn't have enough people or enough experience. So everybody was essentially learning every part of game development all at the exact same time. That makes for a much more clear creative vision because everybody has essentially touched every single part of the game. And when you look at the AAA side of this industry, while like these games are consumer products, they are still works of art at the exact same time. And the more you optimize your business and corporatize your business and you compartmentalize all of these different roles within your company, well, now all of a sudden, all those separate roles, whether it's your concept artists or your riggers or whoever it is, your combat designers, all these guys, well, none of these guys are talking. None of these guys are involved. None of these guys even understand one another's positions because they've never even had to work in those positions anymore. And if you think about it, when I look at some of the best games that I've seen just this last year, most of these studios, they seem a lot more like families than they do like companies. And I think that there's something in that. I think there's something in that bleeding over of roles and that collaboration and communication behind a lot of these companies. But I think a lot of it is born from restriction. That's the thing that really set me off. The minute I started thinking about it, I was like, man, that's probably the biggest, clearest difference between these two sides of the industry. One is actively running away from limitations. The other one is thriving inside of them. The more hardship they're under, the better their games come out. And that makes a lot of sense if you think about just the history of the games industry, because most of these studios came, EA or Activision or BioWare or whoever else, when you start going down the list of all these studios, most of these guys, when they started their studios, they had no idea what they were doing. They had no clue. They were figuring it out on the fly. There weren't any actual disciplines. You can go get a degree in game design or anything like that. You weren't a professional game designer. So it makes a lot of sense that you have this studio that came out of nowhere that's essentially doing it as old school as possible, that makes something that resonates in a way that old school games used to. I think looking at it as well, if you look at just like AI tools, you look at the way that a lot of these companies are engaging with AI right now, that also shows a clear difference in perspective between AAA and the indie side or independent side of the industry. The people that genuinely care, the people that are working on it the hardest, they see it as a tool. They see it as something to mold with or play with or something to get the juices flowing or whatever it might be. But you go and you look over at AAA, AAA sees it as a one-stop solution. They see it as something that will be able to do everything they want it to do, whether that's fix all of their code, whether that's create assets for art for them to use inside their video games. They see it as a way to cheapen the process to quicken the process, to remove friction from the process, where these independent studios and these indie studios are seeing it as just another way for them to be creative. Anyway, hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you guys did enjoy the video, like the video, subscribe to the channel, follow me on Twitch, follow me on Twitter. This is likely going to be my last video before the end of the year. If it is, happy holidays, my friends. I hope you guys have a fantastic holiday. I hope you guys have a safe holiday more than anything else. Thank you guys for an absolutely fantastic year. This has now been year 2, which has been absolutely explosive. I wrote a community post talking about it. We essentially like quadrupled basically every single metric on this channel, which is just absolutely absurd. I know the kitty likes it because he's been getting extra treats as a result of all of it. But yeah, thank you guys for everything. I hope you guys have a safe and happy holiday. I will catch you guys most likely on the new year. Stay cool, stay righteous, stay safe. Peace.
Family, 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 family.